Niamh, let me introduce Niamh. Niamh has worked with teams delivering experiences for companies like Microsoft, Adobe, Wells Fargo, RTE, Fáilte Ireland, Tourism Ireland, to name but a few. And she lectures on the Creative Digital Media Programme at TU Dublin, Manchestown. And that's actually how we met a long time ago. And to encourage the two of us to actually read more books to do with design, we run a UX book club every month. And obviously, all of you are welcome to join. Our next session is tomorrow. We're reading Ruined by Design by the author Mike Monterio. So what we want to do in this presentation is we want to share some of the content that we've been reading about and that we found interesting in some of those books and share it with you. I have a number of examples for you here. I'm sure some of you have heard of a lot of these before. So hands up who's heard of the app Grindr? Or just give me a wave if you've heard of it before. Okay, there's a few people. Yeah, well, in April 2018, BuzzFeed reported that popular gay dating app Grindr, with over 3.6 million daily active users as of that date, was sharing the HIV statuses of their active users with two other companies. Their status was included in a large database simply because no one thought not to include it. In other words, it was designed this way. Next example is Facebook. In 2014, Facebook ran a massive experiment on over 600,000 human beings on their platform. Facebook filled those users' news feeds with overwhelmingly negative news stories to see if it had an effect on their mental health. Facebook ran basically a human mental health experiment on its own users without their consent. Obviously, anyone with mental health issues had no opportunity to opt out. They didn't know what was happening, and neither did anyone else. And it was designed this way, so that's how they designed their platform. Google misidentified images of Black people. So in 2015, a Black software engineer tweeted out that Google Photos AI was categorizing photos of him and his Black as gorillas. By 2018, Wired magazine reported Google had fixed the problem by removing the gorilla categorization from the AI database. Not only was it designed this way, but the problem was in the foundation and it couldn't be fixed without a teardown. In 2017, Facebook upped the ante and did an emotional study by analysing the usage patterns of 6.4 million Australian youth on their platform, including 1.9 million high school kids as young as 14, to figure out when they were feeling their most worthless in order to target them with higher value ads. And the platform was designed this way. So in 2014, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement awarded, this is in the US, awarded Palantir a 41 million contract to build a database for keeping track of immigrants. The Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, considers this database absolutely essential in discovering targets. Among those listed is the now operational database of over 2,000 infants forcibly separated from their parents and put in cages as they applied for refugee status in the United States. So this particular database was built by designers who knew why and for whom they were designing it. So it was designed this way. This one's a really popular one. I'm sure you've all heard of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. In 2016, Facebook exposed the data of over 87 million users to Cambridge Analytica, a company working for the Trump campaign. And in 2018, Mark Zuckerberg was pulled before Congress for questioning. And one of the Democratic Congresswomen, Anna Eshoo, asked him, "Are you willing to change your business model to protect users' privacy?" And his reply was, "Congresswoman, I don't know what that means." And I believe him. I don't know. I don't think they do know how to fix it. because the system was designed this way and evolved this way. In July 2018, The Guardian wrote about how smart devices have become a new hunting ground for stalkers, jilted lovers, and exes. The exes, usually male, were using devices they'd set up to keep tabs on their former spouses or girlfriends. So we've disrupted domestic violence pretty much. And once again, it was designed this way. And one more example from Facebook. We seem to have a few from them today. On July 18th, 2018, Mark Zuckerberg announced he's okay with Holocaust denial viewpoints on Facebook because proving his own point there. And once again, the system was designed this way to allow people to do what they wanted. Oh, sorry. There. The world. So all of these systems that we just looked at, they're designed exactly, or they're working exactly how we've designed them. The world isn't broken. It's working exactly as designers sat down and put pen to paper, or developers, and how we design them, which means we've messed them up. Every single one of those examples could have been stopped by enough people actually, or how or a combination of both. Niamh, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Clodagh. And I can see their own is saying in the chat there that something similar with the Strava example, how the unintended consequences of potential stalkers and domestic abusers using Strava then to track.
Oh, so it's being used for stalking.
Well, people actually, it's not like people have been. They used to do the thing where you publish your runs and you could follow people, and therefore you could know when people were out for a run. So stalkers were able to use it to know when someone was out of the house, and it was like it wasn't intentional, but it was just like that's all.
Yeah. Okay. That's scary. Yeah, it is. And I suppose just to kind of relate it to us and bring it back into UX and to design, just on the next slide there, Clodagh, we've a big job as designers. The discipline has kind of moved from creating the visual and the tangible into orchestrating systems and transformational experiences. So, our scope is just getting broader and broader and broader. And we're reading this month Mike Monterio's Ruined by Design, which is a really great book that goes through loads and loads of these examples that maybe Clodagh has shared with us and more. And he argues that design is a political act, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And what we choose to design, what we choose not to design, who we're excluding, all of these things have consequences. And we have, as designers and people responsible for putting stuff out there, we have power, we have agency, and we have responsibility. The level of that might be, people might vary on their interpretation of that.
Sorry, can I just, can everybody go on mute? Just, there's a bit of interference.
A tiny bit there. Thanks for that, David. Thank you. And do pop yourself off when at discussion points or whatever, but that's actually much better. I can hear a little bit better. That's great. Thanks for that. Also then another super important point, from what we have seen, some of these examples, design can be harmful. We're not it's not a profession without consequences. What we put out there can be dangerous. Another book that we read in the book club was Victor Papanack's Design for the Real World. And he says there's few more professions that are more dangerous than industrial design. And fair enough, the book was first published about 50 years ago, and UX and service design and product design didn't exist, but they belong there now, We read another great book, Cathy O'Neill's Weapons of Mass Destruction. And she talks about widespread, mysterious, and destructive tech. that's increasingly used to make decisions that impact, policing, medical access, financial decisions, recruitment, college admissions, finance, healthcare. And these are all part of, systems that we're maybe potentially involved with as designers. And, we've been designing these massive worldwide networks that manage our personal relationships, and as we've seen, can be used for harassment potentially. And then they don't even know the difference between a good actor and a bad actor. So design has radically evolved, and it's time now for us to evolve with it and to talk about this more and to think about the consequences that we're having. And I think next, Clodagh, another point, some of us are designers on the call, some of us aren't. We're coming from different perspectives, but the renowned UX expert, Gerald Spould, he makes a super important point here, that anyone who influences the design effectively becomes the designer. And this includes developers, product managers, marketers, legal, anyone who influences the final thing that's out there, like a product or a service, is effectively designing and contributing. So we're all kind of responsible. What the professional designer does is they bring intent to that. It's their job. So we're all designers, and Clodagh is going to take us through a few more examples in more detail of, I suppose, the potential harmful effects of maybe bad decisions on our behalf.
Thanks, Niamh. Am I on sound? No, I'm not. Okay. In the book, it's kind of interesting. Mike Monterio, he really kind of focuses on a few companies that he does not like. So we've picked out just a few of them. He mentions Uber over and over again and Twitter. So there are two examples I have here for you. With Uber, the idea is, I'm sure you've all heard of it, ride sharing. Do you have it in Ireland? Is there Uber?
It's free now, I think now, isn't it?
We have Uber as well.
Okay.
Do you have Uber? Yeah. Okay. Well, it's huge here in Australia. It's ride sharing pretty much. And there's loads of advantages to it. Like if you think about the concept behind it, there's at an abstract level, underused car resources, and it puts them to good use. And drivers get a little more extra cash. Passengers get a ride if they need it, and it can reduce the number of cars on the road. So it is kind of, it's win-win in that perspective. However, once a company like Uber goes in for funding, they usually have to apply to venture capitalist firms. And when they get funding, all of a sudden their original purpose goes out the window, and it's like a rat race to try and get more money in so that they can fund another round from venture capitalists again. So they want more capital coming in. It's like venture capitalists are like startup cocaine. And instead of the quality that they wanted to ensure to their customers, that all goes out the window, and it's all just about making money and growing quickly. So in a week, they may have to all of a sudden hire 5,000 new drivers, and you can see that their background checks mightn't be that important anymore, or they might need 500 and 300 designers. So they might go strip through design schools and pick a bunch of inexperienced people. These are the people then building their platforms. So basically you need to expand, and the quality takes a nosedive. So when this happened to Uber, they had a few kind of bad behaviors. At one point, Uber started charging riders higher fares, including notoriously implementing surge pricing during disasters, such as the 2015 terrorist acts in Paris. I know here in Melbourne, every time it lashes rain, it surges. So it might go from, instead of $20, it might go to $50 or $60, just because everyone's on the app. So if there's a terrorist attack, that's terrible. You'd expect them, or you'd hope that they might do something the opposite. They also started skimming more off the top of the drivers' wages, and complaints against drivers abusing riders started to rise. So Uber implemented a harassment campaign against the journalist who published this story. And in 2017, they built a tool called Greyball And it was created to flag riders they associate as their enemies. In other words, city officials or regulatory bodies. And if these people were using their phones to try and get an Uber, it would always say, oh, there's no Ubers in your area. So everyone involved in the making or the conception of this knew exactly what they were doing, and it was completely unethical. And one other thing that Uber does is they track you for 5 minutes once you get out of their car. It's not illegal, apparently, but it's definitely unethical. They say they want to see what side of the road you were dropped off at and if you had to cross the road or not. So yeah, pretty strange. I'll pass you over to Niamh for another example.
And Clodagh, Mike Monterio, he has a special place in hell for Twitter. Like, I mean, he says, listen, it's great if you work in big tech and you're reading his book and you've got an interest in ethical design, but he kind of says if you work in Uber, just quit.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any Uber employees here, but anyway. Another kind of example that's interesting is, I'm sure you're familiar with the Volkswagen emission scandal, but it's kind of how design and engineering have been held accountable for their decisions. So, since 2018, Volkswagen have been marketing a number of their vehicles as high performance, fuel efficient, low emissions, and getting, tax incentives on green brakes for these vehicles. Except these cars were releasing far more pollution into the air than Volkswagen had claimed. They were secretly designed and installed this software into about 11 million cars to deceive the emissions testing. This was called defect device, and it would direct the engine to activate this emissions control when it went through the emissions testing. And then when the car had passed the emissions testing, it would pass the test with flying colours, but then it would hit the road and it would start to release its normal nitrous oxide emissions. So they were deceiving the testing, and they were cheating, I guess. James Liang was the engineer at Volkswagen who led the design and development team. In 2017, a judge in Michigan ruled that it was impossible for James Liang to not be aware of what he was responsible for building and what he was designing and developing. So they proved that he had intent to deceive the system, He was sentenced to 14 months in prison for his involvement. And I suppose he was, following unethical orders of leaders, but by doing so, he became unethical himself. And I suppose it just kind of makes the point that you can't just say maybe that you're following orders in these situations. He was held to account for this deceptive product that he was part of building, and I suppose it's to the point that designers and engineers are now effectively going to jail for poor decisions and unethical decisions. So that is a possibility, Clodagh, I'm going to hand back to you, and you're going to bring us back into Twitter and talk about harassment a little bit.
No problem. We were just saying before this, when Niamh and myself are going through the presentation with the Volkswagen one, do they know about the milligram experiments? It's like you can't blame the excuse of, I was just following orders anymore. Anyway, I'll put a link into the text afterwards. It's quite a fascinating experiment. It's quite interesting. Okay, back to Twitter. So Twitter was founded in 2006, and Jack Dorsey was the CEO at the time. And his first tweet was, the first ever tweet on the planet, just said, "Just setting up my Twitter." And then 12 years later, in July 2018, you had Donald Trump tweeting to the Iranian president at the time, "Never ever threaten the United States again, or you will suffer consequences the likes of which few throughout the history have ever suffered before. We are no longer a country that will stand for your demented words of violence and death. Be cautious." So what happened in these 12 years between the first tweet and the last one? Let's start by looking at Twitter and its first, or who it was founded by. So it was founded by, I think, 5 white guys. They had the best intentions at the time, but later it would collapse under the weight of harassment, abuse, death threats, doxing, and so much more. All the white boys in the room would only ever know how to make decisions as white boys do. This is true to anyone. Even as a designer, if you attempt to look outside your own experience, you'll only ever know what questions to ask based on that experience. Even those doing good research can only ask questions that they think of to ask. In short, even the most well-minded or being white boys don't know what they don't know. So Twitter doesn't deal with harassment because they don't want it. They don't want to. And as Upton Sinclair says, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. Do any of you use Twitter here?
Fortunately, yes.
Thank you so much.
Oh yeah. Well, I think, isn't there a policy that you have to report someone if you're not happy with what they're saying? Twitter won't automatically take them down, apparently. So they leave their harassment policy to their audience. The second reason is that it's too hard to fix any of the harassment in the first place, as it wasn't designed that way in conception. The boys that designed it had a singular viewpoint for a tool that ended up having a global reach. As Twitter grew, it became harder and harder to go back and fix the foundation. At this point, abuse and harassment are as much a part of Twitter's experience as retweets are. And if you think about a few of these things, Twitter was never built in a way to deal with harassment because none of the people designing it had ever been harassed. So it never came up. They never thought about it. Twitter wasn't built to deal with death threats because none of them had ever been threatened. Twitter didn't cater for a way of being stalked because none of those who designed it had ever been stalked. And there's a few other little points here. So apparently it took Twitter 10 years to bring in the blocking feature if someone was harassing you or abusing you. And Twitter's sign-up process had a first name box where you entered your name that only took 20 characters. It only took in 20 characters. And this went on for 10 years as well. And if you note all the names of the founders, their first names all fit in 20 characters, but they weren't thinking about a global expansion at the time. One interesting point about Twitter is, as I mentioned, they like their users to kind of patrol the platform. If you see something you don't like, or if someone's harassing you, you can report it. But they do actually, when they have to, they do build in their own necessary filters. For example, in Germany, there are anti-hate speech laws that ban Nazi symbols, incitement of the people, and hate speech. And yeah, this is because of the atrocities that happened on German soil in the past. And it's also illegal to be a Holocaust denier in Germany. These laws were carried out across social media then as well. So in order to operate in Germany, Twitter had to build in filters that would filter out all the hateful speech that is displayed. So that's quite interesting because when Jack Dorsey, the CEO, was asked, why do you still display all this hateful Nazi speech in the rest of the world? And he goes, oh, well, it's not illegal. So it's an interesting point. Oh, sorry, Niamh, I'll hand over to you for the next example.
Thanks, Clodagh. Another thing that's kind of super interesting is the lack of transparency and I suppose bias and potential discrimination in AI. Cathy O'Neill talks about it a lot in her book, Weapons of Mass Destruction. One kind of area that she focuses on, amongst others, is recruitment and hiring, and how AI systems have become powerful gatekeepers for big employers. one company, like HireView, for example, what they do is they use, your cell phone or your camera, and they analyze your facial expressions during interviews, video interviews. And they'll analyze your facial movements, your tone, your inflection, and they'll give you an employability score and rank you compared to other potential candidates for the job. Scary, as if recruitment is not scary enough and nerve-wracking enough. And like lots of AI researchers argue that this is a pseudoscience and it's not based on fact. The problem is the algorithms are shrouded in secrecy and there's no transparency. It's impossible to figure out how the decisions are made. And then when there's a lack of diversity on the teams that make them, some of these problems with Twitter that Claude has outlined, it's a lack of perspective, complete lack of perspective potentially that creeps in then to these automated things, and now it happens at scale, and humans are completely gone from the process. For companies like HireView, they've become so pervasive in recruitment that colleges are now training students to try and beat the algorithm, and they don't even know how the algorithm works. So you get one student like Nicolette Vartuli, she's a University of Connecticut, really high GPA, math and economics student, who's like freaking out about an interview she's going to. And she went to the interview for a financial institution. She answered confidently. She felt like she gave a really good performance. But when she didn't get this investment banking job, she couldn't see how the computer had rated her so lowly. And she was racking her brains. Was I not friendly enough? Did I not speak more confidently enough? Did I talk too loudly? What did I do wrong? And she said, I feel like maybe it's one of the reasons why I didn't get the job. And then she had this guilt, like I spoke a little bit too naturally, she said, maybe I didn't use enough big fancy words. And then she reflected on it and she said, but I did use the word conglomerate a lot. You're just second guessing yourself. It's how can you compete? How do you know where the rules are? And who are making, it's the systems now making the decisions, and the systems are based on this historical data, and who's feeding the data into these training sets. We don't know. We just don't know is the truth. At least with HireView, though, they finally agreed to an independent audit in 2021. So that's great. That their algorithm is audited, and the audit did give them good scores. Now the audit did point out a few things, like it suggested the company investigate potential bias in the way the system assesses candidates with different accents, because there are different things happening there. And then it also pointed out that minority candidates were more likely to give short answers. So this is going to have an impact on your employability ranking as well. But what about all these systems that are not getting audited, and that sometimes we're not even aware of systems that are making decisions on our behalf? And again, all of these systems are being designed, and we're part of the machine effectively. A very kind of a side note, but another really tragic example is Kyle Beam, who's on the right-hand side here, and he was a Vanderbilt University student, really high GPA. Unfortunately, he had bipolar disorder. He took some time out of college. When he recovered, he went back to college and he looked for a part-time job. And his friend recommended him to a really big recruiter in the States. He did an application for this retail company, and his friend told him he was unsuccessful, and his friend told him that he was red lighted. So the recruitment system red lighted him. And what transpired was he did a personality test as part of the recruitment process. And the personality test was based on the Big Five, which is based on the Myers-Briggs. It tests people for extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism for a recovering bipolar person, and openness to ideas. And unfortunately, multiple really big companies in the States were using the same algorithm or same system for their recruitment process, and he was red lighted with a whole bunch of companies for part-time jobs. He had an almost perfect SAT score. I mean, he was a really high-performing student, and I mean, it's just heartbreaking. He went to his dad, who is a corporate lawyer, and he asked his dad, like, "Dad, how broken am I?" He was obviously blaming himself, and his dad took a class action lawsuit on his behalf. But unfortunately, he took his own life in 2019. So the results of the class action suit didn't proceed. His story is highlighted in Cathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Mass Destruction. And also, there's an excellent documentary on Netflix called Persona, The Dark Truth Behind Personality Tests. And again, the point is, we're part of these systems that are orchestrating this AI now and this big tech. There's no transparency. We bring all of our biases into it, and the lack of diversity on teams then and lack of accountability is causing a lot of harm and discrimination and these unintended consequences, So it's time for us to, I guess, be more aware of these issues, and that's what we're here for today as well. Clodagh, sorry, I went off on one there. Okay, a few things that we can start to consider now for helping us make better decisions, good decisions. Joy Buolamwini, she uses art and research to highlight the unfairness of things like algorithmic bias. So, like the case study that I talked about there. During her first year as an undergraduate at MIT Media Lab, she was running a research project, and she noticed that the facial recognition software that she was using had difficulty focusing on her face. One night she returned from a Halloween party, she was wearing a white mask, and she noticed that the system responded completely differently to her and was able to focus on her while she was wearing the mask. She took off her mask and she was no longer detected. For her research project, she played it safe, and she asked her light-skinned colleagues to complete the research for her because the facial recognition software system had a problem with her dark skin, basically. She shared her experience in a 2016 TED Talk. It's now been viewed over 1 million times. It's like about 10 minutes. I would highly recommend it. And she set up a program, the Algorithmic Justice League. It aims to highlight the bias in code that can lead to discrimination. And she does a ton of things now. She advises a global tech panel, which works with global leaders. She's an international speaker at the World Economic Forum, United Nations. But she suggests that there's 3 things that we can start to do in order to tackle these kind of problems, which is, number 1, to identify the bias that we bring to our work, to the products and services that we're designing, and by building products and platforms that can identify bias by collecting people's experiences and also then auditing. So we heard that with HireVue. By getting independent audits of these kind of AI systems. That's another way to identify bias. Then number 2, by curating inclusivity, by creating more inclusive training sets, and that's, with diverse teams. And then for us to start bringing conscientious thinking into our design. So to think more conscientiously about the social impact of the technology we're creating. And surely that's something maybe small steps we can start with just to start thinking, And then on the next slide, Clodagh, something that Mike Monterio says, and something that is on my mind a lot as an educator, is to start talking about ethics a lot more in design education. He cites examples from Bernard Roth from Stanford Design School, who, they talk about giving their design students creative confidence and changing their self-image so they can be more creative. But Mike Monterio says that we need to teach the practice of how to craft in a way that helps designers make good decisions, and that, you know, by default, design isn't about creation. You know, it's about problem solving. It's about helping people make decisions, and creativity, he feels, is not really kind of central to that discussion, and there needs to be a lot more discussion about design ethics. He actually has a test when he's recruiting people. I think it's a little bit unfair, but when he's recruiting designers, he has this test. He sets a design challenge where he puts a bunch of labels and input fields jumbled up together on a board, like, you know, first name, last name, email, phone number, location, and he asks the designer to design a newsletter form. And if the designer doesn't ask, why do we need first name? Why do we need last name? Why do we need the email field? Then they don't get the job. And he doesn't want designers that simply follow orders. So if you're going for a job with him, watch out. And watch out maybe for that test, I don't know, the design challenge. Quickly, I might run through the next one quickly. He also makes a case for a code of ethics among designers, and, you know, he cites the Hippocratic Oaths, written by Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine. You know, doctors take the Hippocratic Oath before being issued with licenses. He argues that designers should have to sign up for a code of ethics as well. And he gives the example of kind of, you know, imagine a doctor is prescribing oxycodone or something when they know that it's not a good idea and it's potentially harmful for a patient. They won't do it because there's consequences. And imagine a designer then who their boss asks them to implement some kind of dark pattern. We were talking about this before, Val, where maybe, you know, the pattern encourages people behavior that is not good for the end user. You know, what do we do? You know, he asks us, are you acting unethically if you carry out the instructions of your boss? How many of you would do it? How many of you know that, you know, an unethical demand is being placed on you? Does your boss know it's unethical? And he says, in each situation, the doctor and us, they're the same. He says that, you know, we're putting out stuff that we have no idea what our ethical code is, or any resource to kind of to practice one. And he has actually kind of put up a draft ethical code for designers on GitHub if you want to find it out there and learn a little bit more about it. Another thing we can do is to build diverse teams. We have got an example here from Crash Test Dummies. And what happens when there's a lack of diversity in a team designing a product. So in the 1950s, you know, male engineers worked on male crash test dummies. They worked with a 50% percentile, meaning that only for 50% of males would be shorter than the 5'9" crash test dummy. It was only until the early 2000s, under pressure from regulation, that they started introducing female crash dummies, who are still in some tests, even in the EU, that they work with a 5 percentile for females. So 5%, only 5% of females are 4'11" or smaller. The dummies don't even reflect anatomical differences between males and females. So they're not female crash test dummies. They are male crash test dummies that are smaller. And what's even more kind of lamentable is that there's still no seatbelt for pregnant women. I suppose the argument is that, okay, there's a lack of diversity on the teams that maybe are designing these, but there's also a lack of diversity from the regulators and the leaders that are kind of encouraging responsibility. And yes, they are unfortunate consequences. And yes, they're unfortunate consequences and unintended. You know, it's not, in many of these examples, they're unintended consequences. I think I've missed something there, but I've gone off on one again. So do you want to go to the next slide, Clodagh? And this one is hard for us, and I think it's maybe something for us to reflect upon what we can do and what we can't do. Okay, but on the job, we can kind of concern ourselves with maybe unethical industries that we don't want to align ourselves with. Okay, but what about unethical decisions within ethical industries like the crash test dummy, maybe, and the unintended consequences? Ultimately, the decisions about products that potentially can harm people, they can't be implemented without our labor, and that's where our power lies. And a couple of examples, maybe in 2018, thousands of Google employees signed a petition asking their employer to cancel its contract with the US military to use its AI capabilities to analyze drone footage. It was a project called Maven, and dozens of Google employees resigned. And Google, in fairness, said they wouldn't renew the contract. And they did announce principles for future AI projects. But anyway, the next year, Google turned around and they implemented some other Project Dragonfly, censored search engine for China, which again, there was more kind of reaction from employees, and protests rolled in. And a spokesman for Google later said that they weren't going to continue with the Project Dragonfly, which was an internet search engine for China with censored content. Then in the same year, in 2019, in Microsoft, there was an open letter posted to Microsoft's intranet message board that more than 100 employees had signed. And we saw an example from Clodagh where a database had been built for ICE, the US Immigration Service. Microsoft, working with the subsidiary GitHub, had also done some work for ICE. And employees demanded the company's leadership team cancel its contract, no matter what the cost. They had some success, but they had some success. But last year, Business Insider reported that Google, Amazon, and Microsoft are all currently utilizing middlemen to provide services to ICE. Who were separating, children from their parents at the Mexican border, which, obviously has ethical implications. But I suppose there is a message there that through our organised labour, we can have some impact potentially over these decisions. And then if all else fails, Clodagh, on the next one. So if we've no joy with any of these, design education, code of ethics, building diverse teams, being aware of our bias, Mike Monterio says we should just sabotage the system that we are operating in. I'm not sure about this. Maybe some of you can talk to it a little bit, but he advises us to take a leaf out of the Simple Sabotage Field Manual, published in 1944 by the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. It was distributed to supporters, US supporters inside Axis control countries after the Second World War, filled with dozens of tips and tricks for how you can sabotage your workplace. For example, bring up irrelevant issues as frequently as possible in work. Refer back to matters from previous meetings at the start of the next meeting, and just keep talking about them for as long as possible. To lower morale, be pleasant to inefficient workers and give them undeserved promotions. Hold conferences when there is more critical work to be done. Never pass on your skill and experience to new or less skilled workers. And his personal favorite, number 6, act stupid. And we might ask you if any of these sound familiar in your current roles in a few minutes.